Popular imagination tends to picture Havana through the lens of colorful colonial streets, polished American automobiles from the 1950s, lively music drifting across shaded plazas, and weathered buildings that seem frozen in another era. While these familiar images have become the city's international identity, they conceal a far more remarkable and considerably less romantic reality governing everyday life behind those fading facades. The true story of Havana is not simply one of preserving history or surviving economic hardship, but of reinventing the mechanics of modern urban life after losing access to many of the global systems upon which almost every contemporary city depends. In this documentary, we will move beyond the nostalgic postcard to examine how prolonged isolation transformed Havana into one of the world's most extraordinary laboratories of self-sufficiency, where creativity gradually became more valuable than consumption itself. Understanding this transformation requires looking beyond the visible consequences of economic sanctions and toward the deeper structure that once supported the Cuban economy. Following the Cuban Revolution, political tensions with the United States evolved into a long-lasting economic embargo that dramatically restricted trade with one of Cuba's nearest and largest commercial partners. At the same time, the island became increasingly dependent upon the Soviet Union, exchanging sugar for fuel, machinery, fertilizers, industrial equipment, spare parts, food products, and countless manufactured goods arriving from across Eastern Europe. For decades, this arrangement allowed Havana to function much like any other industrial capital, yet much of its infrastructure quietly depended upon continuous deliveries from thousands of kilometers away. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 shattered that system with astonishing speed. Imports declined dramatically, fuel became scarce, factories slowed or stopped entirely, public transportation struggled to operate, agricultural production fell without imported fertilizers, and everyday consumer goods became increasingly difficult to obtain. The economic emergency that followed became known as the Special Period, but for Havana's residents, it represented something even more fundamental than a financial crisis. It challenged the assumption that broken equipment could simply be replaced, that supermarkets would always remain stocked, or that industrial production could continue without uninterrupted international supply chains. Suddenly, the city found itself confronting problems that modern urban societies rarely expect to solve. Unlike many countries recovering from economic collapse through foreign investment or large-scale reconstruction, Cuba had little opportunity to rebuild its previous model. Instead, Havana gradually developed an entirely different approach to survival. Objects that had once been considered disposable acquired entirely new value. Household appliances remained in service for decades through repeated repairs. Industrial equipment was dismantled so its individual components could extend the life of other machines. Old automobiles received handcrafted mechanical solutions that kept them operating long after manufacturers had disappeared. Rather than replacing technology, people increasingly adapted it, repaired it, redesigned it, and ultimately transformed it into something capable of functioning under entirely different conditions than originally intended. This process became closely associated with the Cuban idea of inventos, a concept that extends far beyond simple improvisation. It describes a practical philosophy in which every problem demands a creative solution built from whatever resources remain available rather than whatever products can be purchased. Scarcity gradually encouraged experimentation instead of consumption, rewarding mechanical knowledge, craftsmanship, and neighborhood cooperation over access to new materials. As these habits spread throughout Havana, they produced not isolated acts of ingenuity, but an entire urban ecosystem built upon repair, adaptation, recycling, and continuous reinvention. Throughout this documentary, we will explore the hidden systems that made this transformation possible. We will examine how abandoned land became productive urban agriculture, how workshops manufactured replacement parts without traditional factories, how transportation adapted to severe fuel shortages, and how entire neighborhoods learned to maintain essential infrastructure despite decades of limited external support. By uncovering these interconnected systems, we discover that Havana's greatest achievement was not merely surviving isolation, but constructing an entirely different model of urban resilience in which necessity became the driving force behind innovation rather than its greatest obstacle. By the early 1990s, the consequences of the special period could be felt in every district of Havana. Long before sunrise, people gathered outside nearly empty stores hoping that basic necessities might arrive before supplies disappeared again. Power outages became part of everyday routine, sometimes lasting for hours and sometimes much longer, forcing families to reorganize their daily lives around an unpredictable electrical grid. Public transportation nearly collapsed as diesel fuel became increasingly scarce, leaving thousands of residents to walk several kilometers simply to reach work, school, or hospitals. What had once been temporary inconvenience gradually evolved into a completely new way of living, where uncertainty became the only constant. Yet Havana responded to this crisis differently from many cities facing comparable economic shocks. Rather than allowing neighborhoods to become paralyzed by shortages, people began searching for solutions that depended less upon imported goods and more upon resources already available around them. Empty lots that had sat neglected for decades suddenly attracted attention, not as future construction sites, but as potential farmland. Small courtyards behind apartment buildings became vegetable gardens. Schoolyards, abandoned industrial spaces, and strips of unused land alongside roads were gradually transformed into places capable of producing fresh food. In a city where nearly every square meter had traditionally been viewed as urban space, the distinction between city and farmland slowly began to disappear. This transformation marked the beginning of one of the largest urban agriculture movements ever developed within a modern capital. Without reliable access to imported fertilizers, pesticides, or fuel-powered machinery, Havana's growers adopted methods based largely upon composting, biological pest control, crop rotation, and manual labor. What initially emerged as an emergency response gradually evolved into an efficient agricultural system capable of supplying neighborhoods with vegetables harvested only hours before reaching local markets. Unlike conventional food distribution networks that relied upon refrigerated trucks traveling hundreds or even thousands of kilometers, Havana increasingly shortened the distance between production and consumption until many residents could simply walk to the gardens where their food had been grown. Among the most distinctive features of this agricultural revolution were the organoponicos, intensive urban gardens constructed inside former vacant spaces using raised planting beds filled with carefully prepared organic soil. These gardens required relatively little machinery while producing surprisingly high yields despite limited resources. Over time, they spread throughout Havana, occupying land that previously generated no practical value and transforming forgotten corners of the city into productive landscapes. Instead of treating agriculture as something belonging exclusively to rural areas, Havana integrated food production directly into the urban environment, creating a model that would later attract researchers, architects, and environmental planners from around the world. Equally important was the social structure that developed around these gardens. They were not simply places where vegetables were cultivated, but centers of neighborhood cooperation where practical knowledge circulated alongside food itself. Experienced growers taught newcomers how to improve soil fertility without chemical fertilizers, conserve water during dry seasons, and maximize harvests within extremely limited space. Skills that had once been associated primarily with rural farming gradually became part of everyday urban life, allowing residents with little previous agricultural experience to contribute meaningfully to local food production. Although these changes emerged from necessity rather than environmental idealism, they produced unexpected long-term advantages. Shorter transportation distances reduced dependence upon fuel, composting returned organic waste to the soil instead of landfills, and local production increased resilience against future supply disruptions. More importantly, Havana demonstrated that a densely populated capital could produce a significant portion of its own fresh food without relying upon the industrial agricultural systems that dominate much of the modern world. What began as a desperate response to economic collapse gradually became one of the defining characteristics of the city's identity, proving that even under extraordinary constraints, innovation could reshape the relationship between people, food, and the urban landscape itself. Food was only one part of Havana's struggle. Keeping the city moving proved to be an equally daunting challenge, as fuel shortages crippled nearly every form of transportation. Before the special period, Buses carried hundreds of thousands of passengers each day, supported by a steady supply of imported diesel and replacement parts. Once those supplies disappeared, entire routes were suspended, vehicles sat idle awaiting repairs that could no longer be completed, and daily commutes stretched from minutes into hours. For many residents, reaching work became a journey requiring patience, improvisation, and sometimes several different forms of transport stitched together across the city. The government searched for immediate solutions wherever they could be found. Thousands of bicycles were imported from China and distributed throughout the country, dramatically changing Havana's streets almost overnight. Roads once dominated by buses and automobiles became filled with cyclists navigating between neighborhoods, offices, schools, and factories. Bicycle repair shops multiplied as demand increased, while mechanics learned to manufacture replacement parts from salvaged materials whenever official components were unavailable. Riding a bicycle was no longer simply an economical choice. For many families, it became the only reliable means of transportation. Even Havana's famous classic American cars acquired a new significance during this period. Visitors often admire these brightly painted vehicles as charming symbols of nostalgia, but their continued existence reflects something far more remarkable than historical preservation. Most of these automobiles survived because their owners became extraordinary mechanics, capable of rebuilding engines, transmissions, suspensions, and electrical systems using whatever parts could be adapted from entirely different machines. Diesel engines originally designed for trucks found their way beneath the hoods of vintage sedans. Homemade brackets replaced factory components. Pieces taken from Soviet vehicles, European cars, tractors, and industrial equipment were carefully modified until they worked together inside machines whose original manufacturers had long disappeared from Cuba. Maintaining these automobiles demanded a level of technical creativity rarely required in countries where replacement parts remain readily available. Instead of ordering a missing component, mechanics frequently produced one themselves using lathes, welding equipment, or simple hand tools. Every repair became an engineering problem rather than a routine mechanical service. Workshops accumulated thousands of salvaged bolts, gears, bearings, hoses, and electrical connectors because almost any discarded object might eventually solve a future repair. Over time, these small neighborhood garages evolved into centers of practical innovation where experience often proved more valuable than formal technical documentation. Public transportation also underwent remarkable adaptations. Large trailers converted into passenger carriers, commonly nicknamed camelos because of their distinctive shape, appeared on Havana's roads during the 1990s. Pulled by heavy trucks, these oversized vehicles transported hundreds of passengers at once, offering an unconventional but effective response to the shortage of functioning buses. Although often crowded and uncomfortable, they demonstrated the city's willingness to experiment with solutions that prioritized practicality over convention. In Havana, transportation was no longer expected to resemble systems elsewhere in the world. It simply had to keep people moving. These countless adaptations gradually reshaped the city's relationship with technology itself. Instead of viewing machines as disposable products with fixed lifespans, Havana treated them as evolving systems capable of endless modification. Vehicles remained operational not because original components survived, but because skilled hands continually reinvented them. The boundary between repair and invention slowly disappeared, replaced by a culture in which every mechanical problem invited another creative solution. As the years passed, Havana earned an international reputation for preserving old automobiles, yet the real achievement was never preservation alone. It was the remarkable ability to keep an entire transportation network functioning through ingenuity, craftsmanship, and an unwavering refusal to accept that broken machines had reached the end of their lives. Transportation and food were only the most visible examples of Havana's transformation. Beneath the surface, an equally profound revolution was taking place inside homes, workshops, and apartment buildings, where ordinary objects began living lives far beyond anything their manufacturers had ever imagined. In most industrialized societies, a broken refrigerator, washing machine, or electric fan is eventually discarded and replaced with a newer model. In Havana, that option often did not exist. Every household appliance became a long-term investment whose survival depended not upon warranty programs or replacement parts, but upon the creativity of those determined to keep it running. Neighborhood repair shops became indispensable institutions within the city. Some occupied small garages. Others operated from living rooms or tiny workshops hidden behind residential courtyards. Yet together they formed an informal network that kept thousands of essential devices functioning year after year. Mechanics, electricians, welders, and machinists accumulated decades of practical knowledge, often solving problems for which no manuals existed. A failed motor might receive components taken from an entirely different appliance. Damaged electrical circuits were rebuilt by hand. Plastic housings too brittle to replace were reinforced with metal brackets or custom-made fittings. Every successful repair expanded the city's collective experience, creating solutions that spread from one neighborhood to another through conversation rather than instruction books. This culture of repair also transformed the value of discarded materials. What appeared to be useless scrap rarely remained waste for long. Old refrigerators yielded compressors, copper tubing, switches, and wiring. Broken bicycles donated gears, bearings, and chains. Construction debris supplied steel bars, timber, and reusable hardware. Even damaged electronics were carefully dismantled because individual capacitors, resistors, transformers, or switches might eventually restore another device to working order. In Havana, waste became less a category than a temporary stage in the life of an object awaiting its next purpose. The absence of reliable imports encouraged people to think differently about manufacturing itself. Instead of depending exclusively upon large factories producing standardized goods, countless small workshops emerged to fabricate individual components whenever originals could no longer be obtained. Simple machine tools, many decades old themselves, remained in constant use producing shafts, bushings, brackets, gears, and countless other parts needed to keep equipment operational. Precision often depended more upon the experience of the machinist than upon advanced technology. Measurements were checked repeatedly, adjustments made by hand, and finished pieces carefully fitted until they performed exactly as required. These workshops rarely sought perfection in the conventional industrial sense. Their objective was functionality. If a replacement part restored a machine to reliable operation, it had fulfilled its purpose regardless of whether it matched the original design. This practical mindset encouraged innovation because mechanics felt free to improve upon existing systems rather than simply reproduce them. Components were strengthened where repeated failures had occurred. Simpler mechanisms replaced unnecessarily complex ones. Locally available materials substituted for expensive imported alloys. Every repair carried the possibility of creating something more suitable for Havana's unique circumstances than the original product itself. Knowledge became one of the city's most valuable resources. Skills were passed between generations not through formal education alone, but through daily observation inside workshops and family homes. Children watched parents repair household appliances instead of replacing them. Apprentices learned machining by standing beside experienced craftsmen. Neighbors exchanged techniques for rebuilding pumps, restoring electrical motors, or fabricating missing hardware from salvaged steel. Over time, technical knowledge spread far beyond professional trades, becoming an ordinary part of community life. For visitors, Havana's ingenuity often appears spontaneous, as though remarkable solutions emerge naturally from necessity alone. In reality, this resilience rests upon decades of accumulated experience shared across countless individuals who gradually built an urban culture where repairing, adapting, and reinventing became everyday habits. The city's workshops may lack the scale of modern factories, yet together they perform a task no less significant: preserving the machinery that allows daily life to continue even when global supply chains remain far beyond reach. While workshops and mechanics kept Havana's machines alive, the city's architecture was undergoing its own quiet evolution. Many of Havana's residential buildings had already stood for decades before the special period began, and maintaining them became increasingly difficult as cement, steel, plumbing fixtures, electrical equipment, and construction materials grew scarce. In many parts of the world, deteriorating buildings are eventually demolished or renovated using industrial resources delivered through global supply chains. Havana rarely had either option. Instead, the city learned to preserve its architecture through continuous adaptation, relying upon practical ingenuity rather than large-scale redevelopment. Walking through Havana today reveals countless examples of this process hidden in plain sight. Balconies have been reinforced using handcrafted steel supports. Staircases repaired with locally fabricated railings continue serving buildings far older than their original designers ever anticipated. Water pipes assembled from sections produced decades apart connect homes to municipal systems through combinations that would appear highly unconventional elsewhere. Electrical wiring often reflects generations of careful modifications, each responding to immediate needs while extending the useful life of existing infrastructure. Rather than replacing entire systems at once, repairs accumulated gradually, allowing buildings to evolve alongside the changing realities of the city. Water management became one of the greatest engineering challenges. Aging pipelines, inconsistent electricity, and limited access to replacement equipment meant that many households could not rely upon constant running water. To compensate, rooftop storage tanks became a familiar feature across Havana's skyline. Whenever water became available, these tanks were filled, providing reserves for periods when pressure dropped or pumping stations temporarily stopped operating. Gravity replaced electrically powered distribution wherever possible, creating simple but dependable systems that required little energy once installed. Electricity demanded similar flexibility. Frequent outages encouraged residents to develop routines that minimized dependence upon uninterrupted power. Refrigerators were opened only when necessary to preserve cold air. Cooking schedules adapted to periods when electricity was available. Repairs to household electrical systems were often carried out using salvaged switches, rewound motors, or reused wiring recovered from discarded equipment. Every improvement sought reliability rather than convenience, reflecting a broader philosophy that valued resilience above modern expectations of constant availability. Entire apartment communities also became more interconnected through necessity. Residents frequently shared tools, exchanged construction materials, and cooperated on repairs that no individual family could accomplish alone. If one neighbor possessed welding equipment while another understood plumbing, both skills contributed to maintaining the building as a whole. This informal cooperation reduced dependence upon external contractors while strengthening relationships inside neighborhoods where practical assistance often mattered more than financial transactions. Buildings survived not solely because of physical repairs, but because communities themselves became active participants in preserving the places where they lived. Even architectural space acquired new purposes. Courtyards once intended primarily for recreation evolved into workshops, storage areas, or small gardens. Rooftops supported water tanks, solar heaters, drying racks, and occasionally vegetable cultivation. Rooms originally designed for residential use became repair businesses, tailoring shops, or family-operated enterprises that helped generate additional income. Havana's buildings were no longer static structures serving fixed functions. They adapted continuously to changing economic realities, demonstrating an extraordinary flexibility rarely associated with historic urban architecture. This constant process of modification produced a city unlike almost any other. Rather than preserving the past exactly as it had been, Havana quietly rewrote it, layer by layer, through thousands of practical decisions made by ordinary people solving immediate problems. Every reinforced balcony, rebuilt doorway, repaired staircase, and improvised water system tells the story of a community refusing to abandon its urban fabric despite decades of material shortages. The result is a capital where resilience is embedded not only in the people who inhabit it, but within the buildings themselves, each carrying visible evidence of countless acts of adaptation that transform necessity into a lasting architectural identity. As Havana adapted its transportation, agriculture, and infrastructure, another transformation unfolded beneath the surface, one that was far less visible but equally essential to the city's survival. Scarcity did not simply change how people repaired machines or grew food. It reshaped the entire economic culture of the capital. In places where consumer economies depend upon constant purchasing and disposal, Havana gradually developed an alternative model built around preservation, exchange, and resourcefulness. Objects were no longer measured solely by their original purpose, but by the number of future uses they might still contain. Markets reflected this changing reality. Rather than searching exclusively for finished products, many people searched for individual components. A worn-out appliance might still possess a functioning motor. A damaged radio could provide valuable switches or wiring. Old plumbing fixtures supplied brass fittings that were nearly impossible to purchase new. Pieces of wood, sections of metal pipe, sheets of glass, and even small collections of screws or bolts became commodities with genuine economic value. Entire informal markets developed around materials that would have been considered worthless in societies where replacement remained inexpensive and readily available. This culture also transformed the meaning of ownership. A refrigerator was rarely viewed as a sealed consumer product whose life ended when a major component failed. Instead, it became a collection of systems that could be repaired individually over many years. Furniture was rebuilt instead of discarded. Clothing passed through repeated alterations before finally becoming cleaning cloths or raw material for other household uses. Nothing truly reached the end of its usefulness until every possible function had been exhausted. The concept of waste itself gradually narrowed because almost every material retained the possibility of serving another purpose. The city's mechanics, carpenters, electricians, and craftsmen became some of its most respected problem solvers. Their work extended far beyond technical repairs. They represented the practical knowledge that allowed neighborhoods to function despite limited access to industrial production. When something failed, people often asked not where they could buy a replacement, but who possessed the experience necessary to restore it. Reputation became one of the most valuable currencies in this environment. A skilled repair specialist might receive customers through recommendations spreading from one family to another rather than through formal advertising. This dependence upon local expertise strengthened community relationships in unexpected ways. People exchanged tools, borrowed equipment, traded materials, and shared practical advice with remarkable frequency. A successful repair often relied upon contributions from several different households, each supplying a missing part, a specialized tool, or technical knowledge accumulated through years of experience. These informal networks reduced dependence upon centralized supply systems while creating communities whose resilience rested largely upon cooperation rather than consumption. Over time, this philosophy attracted growing international attention. Urban planners, environmental researchers, and sustainability experts began studying Havana not because they wished to reproduce its economic hardships, but because the city demonstrated principles increasingly relevant to a world confronting resource depletion, rising material costs, and environmental pressures. Long before concepts such as the circular economy entered mainstream discussion, Havana had already spent decades extending product lifespans, maximizing material recovery, minimizing waste, and encouraging local production wherever possible. Practices born from necessity unexpectedly aligned with ideas that many wealthier societies would only later begin to pursue voluntarily. Yet it is important not to romanticize this reality. Life in Havana remained difficult, and many of these innovations emerged because alternatives simply did not exist. Scarcity imposed real hardships, limiting opportunities and demanding constant adaptation from millions of residents. Nevertheless, the city's experience revealed an important truth. Human ingenuity often flourishes most powerfully when conventional solutions disappear. Faced with prolonged isolation, Havana did not invent a perfect society, but it did construct an extraordinary culture of resilience that challenged many assumptions about how a modern city can continue functioning when access to global abundance suddenly comes to an end. Today, Havana occupies a unique place in the modern world because it challenges many of the assumptions that define contemporary urban life. Most cities measure progress through faster consumption, expanding infrastructure, larger supply chains, and an ever-growing flow of imported goods. Havana followed a remarkably different path, not by choice but through decades of necessity. Instead of consuming more, the city learned how to preserve more. Instead of replacing what failed, it mastered the art of keeping things alive. Over time, this philosophy became embedded not only in the city's physical landscape, but also in the mindset of generations who learned that patience, creativity, and practical skill could solve problems that money could not. Visitors often notice the visible symbols of this resilience without fully understanding the systems behind them. The famous vintage automobiles represent thousands of hours of mechanical adaptation. Urban gardens, now an iconic part of Havana, emerge from the urgent need to feed an isolated population. Small repair shops continue performing functions that many industrialized cities have largely forgotten. What appears unusual to outsiders remains an ordinary part of daily life, because these practices have shaped the city for decades. At the same time, Cuba has not remained frozen in time. Economic reforms have gradually expanded opportunities for private businesses, family enterprises, restaurants, and workshops. Tourism has introduced new sources of income, while limited foreign investment has modernized parts of the economy. Internet access, once extremely restricted, has expanded dramatically, connecting Havana more closely with the outside world than at any point since the revolution. These changes have created new opportunities while raising important questions about the city's future. As imported products slowly become more available, younger generations are growing up in a reality different from that of their parents. Modern electronics, international brands, and online commerce now exist alongside long-established traditions of repair and reuse. Across Havana, newly opened cafes stand beside workshops that still rebuild decades-old machinery with handcrafted components. Rather than replacing one another, these two worlds continue to coexist, creating a city where innovation is expressed through both modern entrepreneurship and the ingenuity developed during years of scarcity. Researchers studying sustainable development increasingly point to Havana as proof that resilience cannot be measured by economic indicators alone. Strong communities, practical skills, local knowledge, decentralized production, and the ability to adapt existing resources are equally important. As cities worldwide face supply chain disruptions, rising energy costs, and growing environmental pressures, many are beginning to recognize the value of practices that Havana developed out of necessity. Perhaps the city's greatest achievement is showing that resilience is not built overnight. It grows through countless small repairs, shared knowledge, neighborhood cooperation, and the determination to solve problems with whatever resources are available. Every restored vehicle, repaired appliance, cultivated garden, and reinforced building became part of a larger system that allowed Havana to endure extraordinary challenges. As Havana continues evolving in the 21st century, its future will inevitably differ from its past. New technologies, changing economic policies, and stronger global connections will reshape the city. Yet the culture of ingenuity forged through decades of isolation remains one of Havana's defining strengths, proving that when conventional solutions disappear, human creativity often becomes the most valuable resource a city can possess. In the end, Havana's greatest legacy is not its colorful streets, its vintage automobiles, or even its ability to endure decades of economic isolation. Its true legacy lies in proving that a city is far more than its buildings, industries, or economy. At its core, a city is a network of people, knowledge, and shared experience. When those connections remain strong, even severe material shortages cannot completely dismantle urban life. Havana survived not because it possessed extraordinary resources or advanced technology, but because millions of ordinary people refused to stop solving problems. For decades, residents faced challenges that many modern societies rarely imagine. Machines broke without replacement parts. Fuel disappeared with no certainty of future deliveries. Construction materials became scarce while historic buildings continued to age. Food imports declined dramatically, forcing neighborhoods to rethink how and where food could be grown. Individually, each problem threatened the city's stability. Together, they created one of the most demanding urban experiments of the modern era. Yet instead of collapsing, Havana adapted through thousands of practical decisions repeated every day. This transformation produced something that cannot easily be measured through economic statistics. It created a culture where practical knowledge became one of society's greatest assets. Repairing an electric motor, growing vegetables in limited space, welding damaged machinery, conserving water, or fabricating a missing component became forms of resilience as valuable as financial resources. Skills that elsewhere had become highly specialized remained woven into everyday life. Entire generations grew up believing that technology was not disposable and that almost every object deserved another chance before being discarded. Ironically, many practices born from necessity in Havana now resemble ideas promoted around the world under the banner of sustainability. Governments, businesses, and researchers increasingly advocate repairing instead of replacing, reusing instead of discarding, strengthening local production, and reducing dependence on distant supply chains. Havana embraced these principles decades earlier, not as environmental policy, but as a practical necessity. What began as an emergency response has become an unexpected lesson for a world increasingly concerned with resilience. None of this should be mistaken as an argument in favor of economic hardship. Scarcity imposed real costs, limiting opportunities and making everyday life far more difficult than it might otherwise have been. No society willingly chooses prolonged shortages or isolation. Yet Havana demonstrates how communities can adapt when conventional systems fail, revealing the extraordinary capacity of human ingenuity under pressure. Today, visitors walking through old Havana, admiring its famous automobiles or thriving urban gardens, are witnessing far more than preserved history. They are seeing the visible results of countless acts of creativity accumulated over decades. Every repaired engine, rooftop water tank, handcrafted replacement part, neighborhood workshop, and cultivated garden reflects a philosophy that transformed necessity into capability. Together, they tell a story not only of survival, but of adaptation, perseverance, and shared knowledge. Perhaps that is Havana's most enduring lesson. Modern civilization often assumes that progress depends upon endless growth, constant consumption, and uninterrupted access to global resources. Havana reminds us that another path also exists, one built on preserving rather than discarding, repairing rather than replacing, and strengthening communities instead of depending entirely on distant systems. In an increasingly uncertain world, those lessons may prove more valuable than ever. The concrete oasis that emerged from decades of isolation stands today not simply as a symbol of endurance, but as living proof that resilience is ultimately built by people determined to move forward, regardless of the obstacles before them.